Romy, the 19th Conference of the Parties, or COP19, will be held in Poland, Warsaw, later this year. You've been attending these COP meetings quite regularly. What is your sense of the negotiations to date?
What is quite an interesting thing with the COPs is that they are the climate change COPs, because there's COPs in the other UN processes, there's also COPs, but this on the climate change side of things is very technical. It's difficult to track progress without speaking very much to the technical side of the negotiations itself. But if I can give you a little bit of context, and then I'll explain what we're looking to achieve in COP19 in Warsaw. When we had COP17 in Durban, there was basically an agreement to further negotiate an international climate change agreement. And at that stage, the idea was that the Kyoto Protocol was expiring in 2012, and there needed to be something in place in order to make sure that countries would reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. Not all countries were on board, but the idea was that we had to agree to some form of international agreement. And the discussions since then have basically been on the form of the negotiation, whether it would be legally binding, whether it would be a protocol, what form that agreement would take, and who would it include. And the level of commitment, obviously your developing countries and your developed countries have a disagreement between the level of ambition that's necessary, who's responsible. The developing countries being very specific to equity and sharing the burden and looking at very respective capabilities. Obviously they're not able to do the same things as the developed countries. So there's a lot of discussion ongoing about the form and the nature of that agreement would take. So basically in the next meeting after Durban was the Doha meeting, which was last year, and they basically made an interim step to continue with a second Kyoto Protocol agreement, so that it would just bind countries for the time being. And basically what we've decided is that the new international agreement will be negotiating for 2015, but that it would be implemented in 2020. So there's a bit of space now, and that's why Warsaw is important, is to commit countries to ambitious levels of reductions now, and then to clarify a lot of what the form would be, the levels of ambition. Are we looking for a 1.5 degree centigrade increase or 2 degrees? So there's those kind of things we need to iron out. And then on the other side, which is really important, you've got obviously mitigation and adaptation, which are your two very important themes, but then you've got to make these possible, your financing, which is always on the agenda and always very contentious. You've got your technology requirements and your capacity building requirements, and then issues around transparency and accountability.
So this sounds like a really full agenda for these people who have to negotiate the deal. What are you expecting from COP19?
Well, without going back into the technical things, because there's obviously progress that needs to be made on a number of different issues, and it's a continual agenda, so you're always going to go back to the progress that's made. And also, just as an intervention, this is every year the same group of experts meet at least 4 times in the year, so it's a continuous progress thing. But basically what's really important in Warsaw, and we've seen it through the other COPs, is to make sure that all the parties are negotiating, that it's inclusive, that the multilateral process is respected, and that there's progress made basically on the mitigation side of things, because it's the one area where countries, there's a quick breakdown of trust there, where countries decide to water down issues and leave the room, and you don't want to block in negotiations. You actually just want to make progress.
There's a lot at stake for the African countries participating in these negotiations, and South Africa is a major player in the Africa group. What are some of the main issues that are of interest to this group?
Well, we know, first of all, the Africa Group is a negotiating bloc that's made up of the majority of African countries, and for each African country, there's a lot of differing issues. First of all, so they maintain their national position. So the negotiators will negotiate per country, but at the same time, they do have sort of set ideas about the bloc and what they're trying to achieve. And we know that obviously the common position is more in a setting like the UN. There's obviously they have more leverage and moving as a bloc. South Africa, as you mentioned, is a very vocal part of this bloc, and its position generally is to support the Africa Group position. So Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents to the impacts of climate change, so they always push for the adaptation space to be looked at. So they've been pushing on the financing side for the Green Climate Fund to recognize huge large-scale adaptation projects in Africa, and they look at a multitude of sectors. So it's everything from agriculture to water to forestry to health. which sectors that are most impacted by climate change. So finance is a set thing for the Africa group, and then there's a lot of questions around on the mitigation front around equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing that other countries need to make major commitments. A country like South Africa is one of the countries that does call for an international agreement. It does want specific commitments and targets in place, and South Africa has been quite vocal in that regard. We've put very specific mitigation actions in place, and we're calling for the other developed countries to adhere to their side of the bargain. But it's very much still around equity and shared responsibility. The other things on the Africa agenda, according to the countries, is obviously forestry is still an important climate change mitigation tool. So in your Central Africa belt, you see a lot of African countries pushing to include forestry and financing for forestry on the agenda. And then issues obviously around technology transfer, around equity, better technology transfer that's focused on Africa, capacity building, and sort of all the other general things for developing countries push at large.